If you're like me, you are in a toxic relationship with fantasy football. This season, more than any other that I can remember. This reminds me of that one scene from Brooklyn Nine-Nine when Jake Peralta, Rosa Diaz, they have to prove that they are dirty cops to kind of infiltrate that whole Melanie Hawkins gang, the thing going on there. And then they go to Adrian Pimento. He basically becomes all of us when it comes to fantasy football, laying down the ground rules for what they can and can't do. And hey, nothing's off the table. As we enter week number 6, we need to monitor one of the elite receivers in the game, as Nico Collins appears to be, like the rest of us, day-to-day, week-to-week with that hamstring injury on Sunday. We also got news that Rashee Rice is likely done for the season with an LCL repair. They'll know more later this week when they do surgery. We also need to be aware, once again, there are 4 more teams on their byes. The Kansas City Chiefs, the Los Angeles Rams, the Miami Dolphins, and the Minnesota Vikings. They're all going to sit this week out. It's time once again to look at the wide receivers you are starting and the ones that you are sitting in this week's Roto-Ballers. Start them and sit them at the wide receiver position. Let's talk about those week 6 starts, starting with scary Terry McLaurin here as the Washington Commanders take on the Baltimore Ravens. The Baltimore Ravens are a fearsome fantasy defense, nevermore. What was once a matchup that fantasy managers avoided has now become one that opposing offenses can exploit, at least in the passing game. While the Ravens allow a league-low 60 yards per game on the ground, they rank next to last in passing yards allowed per game, allowing more than 280 yards per contest. From a fantasy perspective, they are allowing 45.75 fantasy points per game this season to opposing wide receivers, and they've allowed 968 yards and 8 touchdowns to the position. Is there a hotter wide receiver right now in the NFL than Terry McLaurin has been over the last couple weeks? After starting out the season with just 39 receiving yards in the first 2 contests, McLaurin has now registered 264 receiving yards over the past 3, including 2 in which he has hit the century mark in receiving yards. People have forgotten or chosen to ignore how good of a passer that Jayden Daniels truly is. Daniels' deep ball accuracy during his final season at LSU was 64% along with 22 touchdowns. People also just casually forgotten that he completed 72% of his passes, so what he's doing right now shouldn't come as a surprise. Expect that deep ball to connect with McLaurin once again this week after seeing the Baltimore secondary get lit up by Joe Burrow, who threw for 392 yards and 5 touchdowns just a week ago. My second wide receiver start of the week, it is DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears, as they take on the Jacksonville Jaguars down in London, England. Don't look now, but the Jacksonville Jaguars are now the friendliest defense for receivers in fantasy football, after allowing a pair of touchdowns to Alec Pierce and Michael Pittman Jr. of the Colts last week. The Jaguars are now allowing just over 46 fantasy points per game to the position. I'm not great at math, but if we look at what the Jaguars allowed the Colts wide receivers and factor in Moore's 2 touchdown performance last week, in which he finished with 105 receiving yards, add another 29% target share to all of that, and we can reasonably assume that Moore is going to project to be a top 12 wide receiver once again this week. Interestingly, just 15 receivers have accounted for 30% or greater of a red zone target share this season. Moore's 31.8% ranks him 13th in that category. Caleb Williams looks for more when the Bears are looking to score, and hey, in fantasy, we love them tutties. It appears that the game is finally slowing down for the rookie quarterback as he is progressing through his reads and connecting with his wide receivers. He has now thrown for 300 or more passing yards in 2 of the last 3 contests. And my third start of the week, how about Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens as they take on the Washington Commanders? Perhaps the Washington Commanders are an improving fantasy defense, or more than likely, the Cleveland Browns need to admit that Deshaun Watson is no longer that guy. Last week, a Commanders unit that had been allowing nearly 40 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers in fantasy held Deshaun Watson to 15 of 28 passing for 126 yards, 60 of which went to Amari Cooper on his 6 grabs on his 10 targets. A Tiger cannot change their stripes. The Commanders, they're still not good when it comes to defending opposing wide receivers. I don't care what last week looked like. Last week, though, on the other side of the ball, Zay Flowers played a significant role in the Ravens' 41-38 overtime victory over the Bengals. In that contest, Flowers, who go on to see 12 targets, hauling in 7 of them for 111 yards, which averaged 15.9 yards per reception. You want a bonus wide receiver? Hey, I got a bonus wide receiver for you. How about Jalen Tolbert of the Dallas Cowboys as they take on the Detroit Lions? If you are looking for that deep sleeper, you may have gotten a glimpse of what Jalen Tolbert could do in the National Football League last week against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Tolbert, he took advantages of coverages rolling over to CeeDee Lamb, and he would post team highs in receptions with 7, targets with 10, receiving yards with 87, and he'd finish the night off with that game-winning touchdown. We know that Lamb, he is going to bounce back this week against the Lions team that had already allowed 873 yards to receivers through the first 4 weeks. There may also be enough meat on the bone for Jalen Tolbert, who had seen 12.5% target share up until last week, where he saw 24.4% target share while running more routes than Lamb. Over the last 4 Dallas Cowboys games, look, targets, Lamb 31, Jalen Tolbert 27. PPR fantasy points, Lamb 62.7, Tolbert 54.5. With a great matchup this week, Tolbert continues to be a solid flex option, especially with 4 teams on buys and injuries decimating the position. Now we have to talk about those fantasy football sits, those football busts, and we're back to Michael Pittman of the Colts as they take on the Tennessee Titans. It was fun while it lasted. After 113 receiving yards in Week 4 against the Steelers, Pittman, he continued to produce for fantasy managers thanks to that touchdown grab against the Jaguars last week. Targets, that's not the question we have with Michael Pittman Jr. The Colts receiver has 37 targets on the season. That is 9 more than the next closest pass catcher, who happens to be Josh Downs. Even with all these additional targets, Pittman has just 2 more receptions than Downs and has 2 fewer touchdown grabs than Alec Pierce at 130 receiving yards fewer than that of Pierce. Tennessee is coming off their bye week. However, prior to their rest, they have been allowing the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers at just 19.78. Through the first 4 contests, the Titans secondary, they've allowed just 95.75 receiving yards to the wide receiver position per game, and they have yet to yield a touchdown. My second sit of the week, it comes courtesy of the New York Jets, and I'm talking Garrett Wilson as they take on the Buffalo Bills. It is a scary world that we live in when Zach Wilson is a better fantasy option for both Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson than Aaron Rodgers happens to be. Now, that said, let's give credit where credit is due. Wilson is coming off his best game of the season in London, where he had 13 receptions and 113 yards, along with a touchdown grab on 22 targets against the Vikings in London. The last time that we saw a player with 22 targets in a single game, that was back in 2015 when Antonio Brown was the benefactor. There is a serious regression coming this week. That really shouldn't have surprised anyone, as Minnesota is allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game this season. Meanwhile, the Jets' opponents this week, their division rivals, the Buffalo Bills, Buffalo is allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points on a per game basis this season, averaging just 24.7 per against. Now, considering that Wilson has been held to 60 or fewer receiving yards in 4 of the Jets' 5 contests this season, it may be wise to fade the Pro Bowl receiver in this one. And my final sit of the week is Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars in London against the Chicago Bears. Now, I can admit when I'm wrong. I'm a big man. I can admit it. It turns out I was wrong about Christian Kirk. He is no longer the number 1 receiver in Duval County. That distinction, it belongs to rookie wide receiver Brian Thomas Jr. Through 5 games, Thomas Jr., he leads Kirk in every statistical category, from receiving yards, receptions, targets, yards per reception, yards after the catch, to touchdowns and fantasy points, everything. This week, it's not going to help Christian Kirk when the Jaguars host the Chicago Bears. They will be facing a defense that just held Andy Dalton to 136 passing yards and limited Deontay Johnson, one of my favorites, to just 3 catches and 23 yards. Kirk, he still holds some PPR value, but if you had to start a Jags receiver in a bad matchup, it's going to be Thomas against this Bears unit that allows just 25.8 fantasy points per game to the position, the 6th fewest. With that being said, make sure to head over to the Rotoballer Discord channel, where you get me 24/7 answering all your starts and sits questions. And for all your news and analysis, head over to rotoballer.com. We'll see you next time.